Welcome to the House of Truth. Today we're going to talk about the grace offering. This offering that's so important, the Apostle Paul, Shaul, spent 2 chapters writing about it. It is an offering that most people have never heard of. They're not aware of it because, well, you'll see why I call it the grace offering. It's there in plain Greek, but most people are not, of course, reading Greek. And we're going to start at where this ideal came from. Did Shaul just come to this ideal out of his head? Or where did he even get this ideal from? We're going to start there. We're going to begin in the beginning. We're going to begin where we often begin, which is in the beginning, in the book of beginnings. Genesis, Bereshit really means in the beginning. Okay, so we're going to start here by looking in Genesis 12, 1 through 3. Now the Lord had said to Abram, get you out of your country, from your kindred, from your father's house, into the land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great. You shall be a blessing, and I'll bless him that bless you, and curse him that curse you. And in you shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Now this is when God first calls Abram. And notice this is conditional. Abram has to do something. He has to get out of his country, get away from his extended family, get away from his father's house, his brothers and whatever. And he has to go into this land he'll show him. If he will do those things, then the Lord, Yahweh, you prefer, will promises him some things. He'll make him a great nation. He will bless him. He'll make his name great. She'll be a blessing. And then he does this thing that affects everyone else besides Abram, who will be called Abraham later. I'll bless him that bless you, and curse him that curses you. And the reason for this is so all the families of the earth can be blessed. So everyone is going to be given an opportunity to get in this blessing, or be cursed, or to be cursed by how they treat, based on what they do with Abraham. Again, called Abram here, his name is not changed yet. Now we're going to look at how this plays out some. In Exodus 27, 29 through 33, we're going to see exactly which people group is going to get this blessing. This is going to apply to, because Abraham was called father of many nations, and he had Ishmael, and through Ishmael had 12 nations, and he had Keturah, who had eight sons, who each become nation after Sarah died. And then of course Jacob, the field of Israel, and the Edomites would make 22 nations. Those make 22 nations that came from Abraham. And of course, those of Lot, who he had kind of adopted, would be associated with him as well. As perhaps they didn't cover him physically, but they were still related. So there's 22 nations, one for every letter of the Hebrew alphabet that came from Abraham. Which one is the question? And that's answered right here in Genesis 27, 29 through 33. Let people serve you, and the nations bow down to you. The Lord be over your brethren, and let your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone that curse you, and blessed be he that blesses you. And it came to pass, as Isaac had made into blessing Jacob was yet scarce gone out from the presence of Isaac his father, that Esau his brother came in from his hunting. He had made a savory meat and brought it forth fire and said to him, let my father arise and eat of his son's venison, that your soul may bless me. And Isaac his father said unto him, Who are you? And he said, I am your son, your son, your firstborn Esau. Isaac trembled exceedingly and said, Who? Where is he that's taken the venison and brought to me, and have eaten all that it came before you, and I've eaten all before you came, and have blessed him? Yea, and he shall be blessed. Well, this is Jacob. So now Jacob, Isaac came down, this God had confirmed it would go through Isaac, and Isaac is now giving it to Jacob. Even though Jacob tricked him, now of course Jacob shouldn't have had to trick him, because God already made it known he wanted the younger to serve, the older to serve the younger, and he already intended to. But Isaac had decided to do things his own way instead. So this came about, and Jacob does pay for his trickery later. Paybacks are terrible, and those are all subjects of future lessons. Well, I do want you to notice is Isaac, even though Jacob tricked him, Isaac could not take it back. What came out of his mouth stuck. So those that curse Israel, Jacob, his name is also his name's Israel, are going to be blessed, and who's that curse him is going to be cursed. And we see this confirmed in Numbers 24, 5 through 9. How goodly are your tents, O Jacob, and your tabernacles, O Israel. As the valleys are they spread forth, as gardens by the river's side, as the trees of line, aloes, which the Lord has planted, and of cedar trees beside the waters. He shall pour water out of his buckets, and his seed shall be in many waters. His king shall be higher than Agag, and his kingdom shall be exalted. God shall bring him forth out of Egypt. He has, as it were, the strength of a unicorn. He shall eat up the nations his enemies, and shall break their bones and pierce them through with his arrows. He crouched, he laid down as a lion, and as a great lion. Who shall stir him up? Blessed is he that blesses you, and cursed is he that curses you. So notice this, in the wilderness here, Esau. Balaam, the prophet of God, who has vision with his eyes wide open, who cannot say except what God puts in his mouth, says that Israel, those that bless Israel will be blessed, those that curse Israel will be cursed. And one last thing, don't get hung up on this word unicorn. That's King James. In King James's time, that was the English word for a rhinoceros. So it's not talking about some mythical animal with one horn, a horse with one horn growing out of its forehead. It's talking about a rhinoceros. There's a lot more in this passage, but it's not pertinent to what we're talking about. Now we're going to look and see how this plays out some in the times. First of all, starting the time of Yeshua, Jesus. In Luke 7, 2 through 7. And a certain centurion servant, who was dear to him, was sick, ready to die. When he heard Jesus, he sent him to the elders of the Jews, beseeching them to come and heal his servant. And when they came to Jesus, he sent to them the elders of the Jews, beseeching him to come and heal his servant. When they came to Jesus, they besought him, instantly saying, that he is worthy for whom this should be done. He loves our nation. He's built us a synagogue. Then Jesus went with them. When he was now not far from the house, the centurion sent friends to him, saying unto him, Lord, trouble not yourself, for I am not worthy you should come under my roof. Wherefore, neither I thought myself worthy to come unto you. But say the word, my servant shall be healed. And we know the rest of the story. Jesus marveled at how great this man's faith was. He explained that he was a soldier under authority, and he recognized the authority of Yeshua. And his servant indeed was healed. But notice this. Why did these guys go to Jesus, these elders of the Jews, go to him on his behalf? Because he was worthy. Why is he worthy? Because that promise, the blessings that bless Israel. And he had been blessing Israel. He loved them. We didn't just love them like, oh, I love you, man. No. It wasn't touchy-feely. He did something about it. He built them a synagogue. And that'd be like today, someone building a congregation, a church, and paying for the whole building and the land, everything themselves. This is an expensive underdoing. He put action to his words. So he blessed Israel, and he himself was blessed. And his blessing wasn't money, it was his dear servant being healed. He thought he was going to lose him, but instead he came back. Instead he got him back to life. He got a servant healed for life. Now we're looking at another case after the time of Yeshua, in the time of the apostles. About 10 years after the resurrection of Messiah, a little bit more than 10 years. So in Acts 10, 1 through 4, there was a certain man in Caesarea named Cornelius, a centurion of the band called the Italian band. A devout man, one that feared God with all his house, which gave alms to the people and prayed to God always. And he heard in a vision, evidently about the 9th hour of the day, an angel of the Lord coming to him and saying to him, Cornelius. When he looked, he was afraid and said, "What is it, Lord?" He said, "Your prayers and alms are come up for a memorial before God." Okay, first I want you to notice that this thing about Cornelius, he's with the Italian band. And no, that doesn't mean like a group with a harmonica and whatever, singing like little love songs in Italian, a band of soldiers. And notice they're Italians. They're from Italy, where Rome's at. This man's in Caesarea, which is in Israel, but it's a miniature of Rome that Herod the Great built in Israel. And it's the administrative capital of Israel under the Roman. For a lot of things, the de facto capital was Jerusalem, but for Roman administration, Caesarea was the capital. So they kind of two capitals there inside of Israel. This man's there, very much Roman, very much Italian. But notice, he's a devout man. He's a God-fearer. Like the last guy seems to be a God-fearer, the other centurion. This one's a God-fearer. And we talked about the God-fearers when I talked about the feast dedication last week, where they came from. And what that meant. It meant they worshiped God, no longer worshiped idols. But they hadn't been grafted in Israel. They never became Jews through circumcision. When it came to circumcision, they just couldn't make the cut. But they still have a place in the world to come. And this God-fearer loved the people. What people? The Jewish people where he's at. And because he loves the Jewish people, and he spent his time praying, perhaps for the good of the Jewish people as well, it hasn't escaped God's attention. He remembers him. There's a memorial for Cornelius, and has been being built in heaven. There's a memorial before God, because God has made a promise concerning those that bless Israel, and he's taken note, and he's about to keep it. He's about to fulfill it. Acts 10, 30 through 33, we see how it's fulfilled. And Cornelius said, 4 days ago I was fasting in this hour. In the 9th hour I prayed in my house. Behold, a man stood before me in bright clothing, and said, Cornelius, your prayer is heard. Your alms are had in remembrance before God, or had in remembrance of the sight of God. Now therefore send the Joppa and call there Simon, whose surname is Peter. He lodges in the house of one Simon, a tanner, by the seashore, by the seaside, who when he comes shall speak unto you. Immediately therefore I sent to you, and you have done well, you are come. Now therefore we are all present before God, to hear the things that are commanded you of God. Okay. So because his alms, gifts to the poor people of Israel in this context. And I talked about giving alms a couple lessons back. Because of this action, because he took action, he is wanting to know God more. It's apparent from the context of what's been heard. And God answered his prayer. He sent someone to him. Now, Simon is a Greek variation of Shimon. It's a Hebrew word. Peter Peter comes from Petra. Petra's a massive mobile rock. Peter's a pebble, a stone. Okay, it's Greek. So this is the same guy, Peter in Greek. Simon Peter, Hebrew, Greek names, same guys. Another Jewish man, Shimon, Simon the tanner. So where he's staying at. He says, sends people, I'm giving to you how to find it. When Peter came, him and his friends were all gathered together to hear the things commanded for Peter to tell them. And the rest of the story is Peter told him while he was still preached to him about Jesus. The Holy Spirit fell upon them because they apparently had believed that Yeshua was Messiah. Fell upon them as proof they were accepted. They began to speak in tongues, and then they were baptized. So now they have been made Jew and Gentile. They made one with the Gentile, with the Jews that believe, despite not being circumcised physically. That was the greatest blessing they could have possibly gotten. So those that blessed Israel were blessed. Those that we didn't even look at it as cursed, but those who blessed Israel were blessed. These Gentiles, in accordance with the promise given to Abraham, and it was confirmed to apply to the nation of Israel, or the Jewish people, as we call them today, but particularly in the land of Israel. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's good for them. They were in the land of Israel around Jewish people and the opportunity to bless them. But what about me? Maybe, I'm out here in Oklahoma, say, where I live, and it's a little far, and I can't go to Israel. I may never get to go to Israel. And, if I do, then what? I have to either establish myself and start living among them and then figure out a way to bless them. What do I do in this case? Well, we're going to go back to the Torah to get the answer to this question. An insight to how we can bless Israel even if we don't live there. So we can get on this blessing. Deuteronomy 14:24-26. And if the way be too long for you, so you're not able to carry it, or if the place be too far from you, which the Lord God shall choose to set his name there, when the Lord God has blessed you, then you shall turn the money and bind the money in your hand, and shall go to the place which the Lord your God shall choose. And you shall bestow the money upon whatsoever your soul desires blessed after. For oxen, for sheep, for wine, for strong drink, for whatsoever soul desires, shall leave it for the Lord your God, and you shall rejoice, you and your household. Okay, so in this context, it's talking about tithes. And notice it's tied to a feast. Buying the things you need to celebrate the feast when you get there. Okay, so what do? You instead of you trying to drive a bunch of oxen, sheep, and maybe carry a cask of wine, in particular if you're far off, or you just aren't able to carry it, it's too heavy, or whatever the case is, you're supposed to turn the money, bind up the money, set it aside, bind it up. It's on in your hand. This money has now been earmarked. It is now sacred. And you go to the place, and then you get what you need. And notice the things, again, that you need are associated with feasting, with eating. So that's the first step, what you do. Now, the second thing we're going to see here is in Deuteronomy 16:14-17. We get some more insight about what we should do with this. And what's the purpose of this money? We're going to look at that. And you shall rejoice in the feast, you and your son, your daughter, your manservants, your maidservants, the Levite, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow that are within your gates. 7 days you shall keep a solemn feast to the Lord your God in the place which the Lord shall choose, because the Lord your God shall bless you in all your increase and all the works of your hands. Therefore you shall surely rejoice. 3 times a year shall all the males appear before the Lord your God in the place which you shall choose. In the feast of unleavened bread, in the feast of weeks, in the feast of tabernacles, they shall not appear before the Lord empty. Every man shall give as he is able, according to the blessing of the Lord your God, which he has given you. So notice who it's a feast again, and notice who this feast is. This feast has to be the place the Lord shall choose. That's Jerusalem. And notice this in this feast. Notice here, it's talking about which feast. These 3 times a year when you're to appear before the Lord in Jerusalem. The Feast of Unleavened Bread, and when you appear before Him, and during the time of Feast of Unleavened Bread, that whole week is on the Feast of First Fruits. Whenever supposed to bring a bikarim, a sheath of grain of barley grain, plus other things, but at least that you have to appear. You're supposed to bring that to the temple. The Feast of Weeks, Shavuot, also known as Pentecost. When you bring some wheat. And the Feast of Tabernacles, when you bring everything else, particularly grapes, which is actually wine at that point. The way they ready to refrigerate them. So unless you're living really close to Jerusalem with table grapes, it's going to be wine. But notice, so this is the context. These 3 times a year, these 3 feasts, and we'll see how this play out important to us believers in the New Testament in a moment. And notice you're not to appear before Him empty; you're to give as you're able, according to the blessing that God has blessed us. So those who've been blessed a lot are to give a lot; those who've been blessed a little to give a little. It should be proportional to what you've been blessed with. And what's the purpose of all this things you're given? God doesn't need money. He doesn't need food, drink, any of this stuff. People do. His people do. And He's to make sure everyone has what they need. And you start with, as I talked about when I talked about giving, you start with your own family. And then you move to those who aren't your servants, your employees, who are kind of like family. They're like family, but they're not your blood relatives, but they're like family. And then you go to the ministers, like I talked about when I talked about paying tithes. Then you go to the father, the widow, the stranger, which is a foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. As I talked about in giving alms. So the purpose of this is to take care of the poor people in Israel, particularly in Jerusalem, or especially in Jerusalem. Now we're going to see how Shaul applied this. I said the Apostle Paul applied this to believers with the grace offering, which we will see why I call the grace offering in a little bit. 1 Corinthians 16, 1-5. Now concerning the collection of the saints, as I have given order to the church of Galatia, so do you. Upon the first day of the week, everyone you laden by store, as God has prospered him, there be no gatherings when I come. And when I come, whomsoever you shall approve by your letters, them I'll send you to bring your liberality into Jerusalem. And in meet that I shall go also, they shall go with me. Now I'll come to you when I shall pass through Jerusalem, when I pass through Macedonia, for I do pass through Macedonia. I'm sorry. Okay, now, it's what? A collection for the saints. Okay, believers. Believers where? In Jerusalem. He gave what? This order also not just to the Corinthians, to the church of Corinth, but to the churches of Galatia as well, which was like Antioch, Pisidia, Derbe, Iconium. Those churches he established on his first mission. He went to first to this before he started his second and third missions. He always went to those churches first and expanded from there. So he's got this collection going on for the saints of Jerusalem. But when they tell them this story? The first day of the week. Now you might think that's every Sunday, which is understandable. It does say first day of the week. However, if you read it, if you go read this in Greek, it doesn't say the word Amera day is not even there in that phrase. It's Mian Sabbaton, literally first Sabbath. In the add to the confusion, the term first Sabbath is used of the day when Yeshua rose from the dead I believe it's in the gospel. I believe it's in the Gospel of Luke. One of the Gospels, it mentions that everywhere else it actually says first day. Okay, the first day of the week. But so because it can be both. So what's the first Sabbath? Well, like in the case I just described, remember the feast, the first fruit, the first fruits always falls on a Sunday on our modern calendar, on the first day of the week. It's the day after the Sabbath, and they count and you don't count the Omer as the rabbis teach to get to find Pentecost, Shavuot. You count the Sabbaths, and you count Sabbath 1, 2, 3, 5 through 7, or you also count days in some cases. Another way to count. 50 days inclusive, but other places that's why it's called Feast of Weeks. You count the Sabbaths. And the day after the seventh Sabbath, which would be a Sunday, is Pentecost or Shavuot. So both of those, during that week, you have two Sabbaths because they are called Sabbaths. You have the high Sabbath, called high Sabbath because one of these, there's 7 of these, or 8 if they count. If one of them happens to fall on the regular weekly Sabbath, the rules for it override the regular weekly Sabbath rules. That's why it's called the high Sabbath, like in the Gospel of John. But but Pentecost, first fruits Pentecost will always, those weeks will always have 2 Sabbaths. The first Sabbath is that special Sabbath, not the regular weekly Sabbath. And 6 out of 7 years, the first day when people would logically give their offerings and stand before the Father in the Feast of Tabernacles, so everyone can be taken care of. 6 out of that one's the 15th day of the 7th month, just like the 15th day of the month on our current calendar. It can happen any day of the week. It could change. It'll happen different days of the week and different years. But 6 out of 7 times it's not going to happen on Sabbath. So that week, most of the times, also going to have 2 Sabbaths. So because the weekly Sabbath is always the last day of the week, these Sabbaths are first Sabbaths. So Paul wants them doing this, doing on these first Sabbaths, so they don't all try to get it all together when he finally gets there. And in ancient times, particularly farmers, these are the times when they're getting paid, so to speak. So just don't if you're in agriculture, do it on payday, basically, and go ahead and put this aside. And then he's going to notice he's not going to go take their money by him. He's not going to take his money. He's going to let them pick who they choose to take this offering to verify that it really went to Jerusalem for the purpose intended. Accountability, which we'll look at some more. And Paul will go with them himself if he can. But first he's going to have to go through Macedonia, and we'll see why it's important later that he mentions this. Now we're going to see how Paul carried out what he said. We're starting here in Acts 20, verse 16. For Paul determined to go to sell by Ephesus because he would not spend time in Asia. For he hastened, if it were possible for him, to be at Jerusalem the day of Pentecost. He wasn't just wanting to be at Pentecost so he could be there, for that holiday. He'd been away from Jerusalem many years. He was in Ephesus for 3 whole years, had celebrated Pentecost. He mentions by that name in Ephesus at one point, okay? So it's not about being there to celebrate this holiday by itself. It's about bringing this offering on that holiday. Because that was the commandment. If he can't make this one, he's going to have to wait 4 months, roughly. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 16, 17 weeks or so, 17 weeks or so for the next one, the Feast of Tabernacles. So he's in a hurry to get there. And we see indeed he did. And he tells about getting there here in Acts 24, verses 14 through 17. But as I confess unto you, that the way after which they call heresy, so I worship the God of my fathers, believing all things are written in the law and the prophets, and have hope towards God, they themselves also live, should be a resurrection of the dead, both for the just and the unjust. And what I do, exercise myself to have a conscience void of offense towards God and towards men. After many years, I came to bring alms to my nation and to my offerings. Okay, now first of all, I want you to notice here that Shaul did not reject what we'll call the Old Testament in some fashion, the Tanakh. No, he believed the Tanakh, the law. He wasn't against the law. And I discussed that when I wrote about Paul, last night about Paul and the law, what he had to say about it. As the biggest slander against Shaul, the Apostle Paul, there ever was, he was somehow contrary to the law. His words and his actions clearly demonstrate that was not the case. And that's what he is telling here to Agrippa. Their only problem is that he's preaching the resurrection of the dead. He has hope. He has hope with the resurrection of the dead, which the Pharisees allowed. So he has a good conscience. So why did he come down to Jerusalem and basically end up here in trial? I mean, waiting to go to Rome. It basically a 5-year process that ends with him saying before Caesar. Why? Because he came to bring alms, gifts for the poor, and offerings. So remember, it's an offering because it's one of these offerings every man shall offer in accordance to what God's given him, we saw. And it's alms because it's being used to help the poor. And this is referring to the grace offering, which we'll look at a little bit and see why I call it the grace offering. Now we're looking at Galatians 2:9-10, and we're going to learn that we're going to see if this is not just Paul's ideal, and we're going to see even when this whole collection process really started. This whole idea of these churches making these collections for this grace offering. Galatians 2:9-10. And when James, Cephas, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given to me, they gave to me and Barnabas the right hands of fellowship, that we should go into the heathen as they go and they unto the Gentile, the circumcision. Or they would remember the poor, the same which we're also for to do. So notice James. This is the brother of Yeshua, not the brother of John who'd been killed. Cephas, or Cephas if you prefer. That's really Cephas. Aramaic name for Peter. He's only called by this twice. But it's the same as Peter. This is Peter, and John, Yochanan. And they're the pillars. They're the pillar. They're the three in charge of the church in Jerusalem. And the grace of God had been given to him. This grace that was given him was going to the Gentiles. But they're asked to do something. Remember the poor. The poor of where? Jerusalem, Israel, particularly Jerusalem, where they're at. And he was very forward or anxious to do so. They have to ask him twice about this. And that, by the way, this conference here, we find a parallel passage in Acts, occurred after his first mission before he went on the second mission. And remember, the second mission's first reason was to carry message about the Gentiles not need to be circumcised. Well, Paul carried another message for him as well to these churches established on the first message, on the first mission, and that was about this grace offering. And so this is not Paul Shaul's crazy ideal by himself, but the church, the headquarters of the worldwide church at the time in Jerusalem, the pillars who are in charge of it. Ask him to do this as well. Now we'll start looking at the details of how he carried this out concerning these Gentile believers. And we're going to start here in Romans 15:25 through 28. Now I go to Jerusalem to minister to the saints. It has pleased them of Macedonia and Achaia to make a certain contribution to the poor saints which are at Jerusalem. It has pleased them verily, and their debtors they are. For the Gentiles have been made partakers of their spiritual things. Their duty is also to minister to them in their carnal things. When therefore I perform this and seal this fruit, I'll come by you into Spain. First, just to clarify, so we don't get focused on that too much. This coming by them into Spain, Paul's proposing of Spain. He mentions that one other time he planned to go to Spain. But notice he'll come by them on his way to Spain, but that's not how he ended up coming by to them. He came by to them by way of the Roman prison system instead, where he's under house arrest. And then after that, we know from his letters, he went back to the church that he had started to strengthen them. Came back to back to Rome, to help the strength of the church there under terrible persecution, where he was arrested and eventually executed. I mean, his charge was literally being a Christian, and there was obviously way too much. I mean, there was overwhelming evidence the accusation was true. So Until said, well, try to make it this fanciful thing where he went to Spain. It's not mentioned in any of his writings. It's not mentioned in the gospel. His writings track where he went fairly well. But if somehow he didn't manage, the best he could have done was went to Tarragon, down there in the southeast coast of Spain, where there was a large Jewish population in the city down there, I believe, that became Cordova later. He could have went there for a day, maybe, and start a congregation like I discussed where he did before, was look at his travels through Acts, and left. But there's no real evidence he ever went to Spain. They certainly go there and live for years and start a church and all that stuff that people say. Just want to clarify that. But what did he do? Well, here he went to Jerusalem. He's going to Jerusalem to take what? To minister to who? To the saints, the believers. What saints? The poor saints in Jerusalem. He's ministering to them what? He's ministering to them the contribution from Macedonia and Achaia. Them in Macedonia. Well, what's in Macedonia and Achaia? Macedonia is where Berea, Thessaloniki, and Philippi's at. As in the letter to the Thessalonians and the Philippians letters. They are making contributions. Achaia is where Athens, Corinth, and Cenchreae are at, which is the port of Corinth, where Phoebe's from, who we'll discuss in a moment. And so he's there. So he's got all those churches covered. Remember, Galatia was all the others. So now we've got most of his churches that he started covered here. And what are these churches doing? They're making a contribution. This is the grace offering. And again, also we'll expound upon why I call it the grace offering in just a couple of minutes here now. But why does he say? Why he gives another reason that these Gentiles should do this besides the promise that God will bless those that bless Israel, curse those that curse Israel. Because they really do owe it to him. It's not just, it is their duty to minister to those those poor saints in Jerusalem in their material things, because they have been partakers in the spiritual things that belong to the Jewish people. Salvation came to the Jews, Yeshua said, is of the Jews and the dead. Without the gospel, the Gentiles were lost without hope. It was Jews who brought the gospel to every Gentile group ever originally. Even when I talked about St. Patrick a while back, it came to England through a Jewish man named Ilid in 54 AD, who, by the way, was a disciple of Paul. So, so they do owe, so the Gentiles do owe Jewish people something, but they don't owe all Jewish people something. They owe the believer something. So therefore, Paul is going to take care of this business. Now we're going to look at some more that Shaul wrote about this grace offering, including when we get into why I call it a grace offering. For we would not, brethren, have you ignorant of your trouble that came to us, that we were pressed out of measure, above strength, insomuch we spared even of life. When we had a sentence ourselves, we should not trust in ourselves, but in God which raised the dead, who delivered us from so great a death, and is delivered, in whom we trust also will deliver us. You also helping us together, that the gift bestowed upon us by the means of many persons, thanks may be made, given by many on our behalf. Okay, so Shaul now talking about he has this trouble, and part he's collecting this grace offering in Asia. Well, where's Asia? That includes, remember the 7 churches of Asia that Yochanan, John was sent to later in Revelations 2 and 3 with the letters, the letters in Revelations 1 through 3, these letters. So those included Laodicea, which is near Colossae in Hierapolis. It includes Ephesus. It includes those other 5 churches, Philadelphia and Thyatira, in Sardis and Pergamon. It includes these other churches. So now Paul has made mention of this when it connects the grace offering of all the churches he's gone to. And the gifter, the word gifter is charis, and it's literally grace. It's the same word translated grace everywhere. It's also where the word people get charisma from, charismatics. Okay. Some of the gifts of the Holy Spirit. But in the context of a physical gift, of an offering, it's only used, there's different words used for offerings, but this one's only used about the offering collected to help the poor, persecuted saints in Jerusalem. That's why I call it the grace offering. Because it really should say the grace be stored upon us. And it's poured upon them for what? By means of many persons. Those in Corinth, those in Galatia, those in Macedonia. I should say those in Achaia. He's going to collect the ones from Corinth. Those in Asia. All these congregations he started over all these years. This is now his 3rd mission he's on right here. This is one of the purposes of the 3rd mission. The second one, he told them about this and got them used to collecting it. Now the 3rd one, he's going to collect all their collections to bring it all down in one big giant bundle of blessing to Jerusalem. And what's the results of that going to be? Many thanks are to be given to many by many on our behalf. The saints in Jerusalem are going to thank God for this. And he continues on here in Second Chronicles chapter 1 verse 12 through 16, where he spells out this grace is for Jerusalem and the people in Judea, or the land of Israel. For our rejoicing is this, the testimony of our conscience, with simplicity and godly sincerity, not with fleshly wisdom, but by the grace of God, we have had our conversation in the world, and more abundantly towards you. But we write none of the things unto you that you read or acknowledge, but and I trust you shall acknowledge even to the end. Also, you have acknowledged us in part, that we are your rejoicing. Even so, you are ours in the day of the Lord Jesus. And in this confidence, I was minded to come before to you, that you might have a second benefit, and to pass by you into Macedonia, and come again out of Macedonia unto you. And of you, you may be brought on my way towards Judea. So he talked about this gift that is going to cause us joy, and they're rejoicing in that because it's by the grace of God, this manner of living our lives selflessly, to take care of others, and they're being more abundant towards them. It's by God's grace he even was able to come to them in the first place. And he has confidence they're going to do what they said. But he tells them ahead of time, I'm passing by you to go into Macedonia first. Then I'll come out of Macedonia to you. Then from there, I'll go to where? Judea. And that's where he's going to take the grace offering to. As we saw, and where we saw he did indeed take it to. So the second mission, he started preparing them. On the third mission, as he went there, he collected, he started having them collect. As he went along, he collected from all those places to finally end up in Judea with the sum total collection of many years from all these places. These congregations he had started. And his plan is for Corinth to be the last leg of his journey before he goes back to Judea. Again, notice that was his plan when he wrote this letter. He ended up having to make some modifications due to persecution later. Now we've laid down all that context. We're going to now look at these two chapters he wrote that deal primarily with this one thing, the grace offering. 2 Corinthians 8, chapter 1 through 5. Moreover, brethren, I do you to wit the grace of God, to know the grace of God bestowed upon the churches of Macedonia. That in great affliction of abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abound the riches of their liberality. For to their power I bear record, and beyond their power they're willing of themselves. Praying as much tree would receive the gift and take upon us the fellowship of the ministry of the saints. And in this they did, not as we had hoped, but first gave themselves to the Lord, and unto us by the will of God. So he wants them to notice the grace of God bestowed upon the church of Macedonia. Because you're not able to give this way without the grace of God. That is enabling power. They were in terrible affliction themselves. And in this affliction brought them into deep poverty. I mean, Philippi was a Roman was a retiree colony of Roman soldiers. But it abounded into the riches of their liberality. They gave richly nonetheless. Not only they give beyond what was reasonable, beyond their power, they gave way beyond what was reasonable for them to give. But they pressed and they pushed them to take the gift. I mean, it's like Shaw was saying, hey, wait, I don't think you can afford. No, you take it all. And the ministering of they were concerned about, they wanted to have fellowship in the ministry of the saints, the poor saints in Jerusalem, again, the context we've been looking at. And because they gave themselves to the Lord. And unto those who were collecting this offering by the will of God, because it was God's will, as we've seen, to take for this to happen. This grace offering is the will of God. Now we're going to look at where Shaw will continue some more and expound upon this grace offering as he employs them in giving it abundantly. 2 Corinthians 8, chapter 8, verses 6 through 10. Insomuch we desire Titus, that as he had begun, so he had also finished you in the same grace also. Therefore, as you abound in everything, in faith and utterance and knowledge and all diligence, and your love to us, that you're bound in this grace also. I speak not by command, by the occasion of the forwardness of others, to prove the sincerity of your love. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, and through his poverty, and that you through his poverty might be rich. Herein I give my advice. For it is expedient you have begun before, not only do, but also be forward a year ago. Okay, there's a little bit in here to explain here. Now, Titus is a Gentile. If you go back there in Galatians 2, we looked at earlier, and look a little bit above, you'll see that he went to Jerusalem. They're arguing about whether or not the Gentiles had to be circumcised to be saved. And the verdict was he was not compelled to be circumcised. He was not circumcised. He is a Gentile in every sense of the word. He's a Gentile believer, though. Circumcision does not bring salvation. Circumcising the flesh doesn't save people, never did. It did mark you as a special group among the saved, which I talked about with the kingdom inside the kingdom. But it's not necessary to be considered be part of the people of God. So what's he want to do? He wants to finish them this same grace also. This offering it's talking about. He's not sending Titus to preach to them. Paul's saying, as you have abounded everything good spiritual we brought to you, and your love for us, and your love to us, see that you abound in this grace offering also. That's what he's talking about. He says grace here. He could just as easily said gift or offering. But he doesn't speak this by commandment, but by the occasion of the forwardness of others. Now, what's he talking about there? He's talking about, so the Greeks are competitive. I used to live in Greece. I lived there for 2 years. I learned to read Greek very well once upon a time and speak it enough to get by in 2 years. And I can tell you this, the Greeks are competitive. In the church, if one Greek saw an angel, then would come by and he saw a bigger one, or somebody else would come by and say he saw 10. And sometimes, a lot of times it wasn't true, but they were just competitive. We should know this. They literally invented competitive sports and other kinds of competitions. And Paul is playing on that Greek competitiveness. He's been touting to them, saying, hey, look, you've been bragging. The Macedonians heard about it, and look what they did. Now, what you were bragging about a year ago, it's time to put your money where your mouth is, literally in this case. And it's expedient for them to do so. And he says, part of the reason is to follow the example of Yeshua, Jesus. Yeshua. To say he was rich is an understatement. He was the heir, equal with the Father. He owned the earth and everything in it. He became poor. He grew up in a poor family in a poor town. In his ministry, he didn't even have a place to lay his head. And had to rely daily for the Father to take care of his needs. And why? So we could become rich. And again, rich when? Rich in this world, perhaps in some people's cases, material things, but mostly rich in the world to come. We're going to rule and reign with him as priests and kings. And that came about because of his becoming poor on our behalf. This is another reason we should be willing to give the grace offering, even if it's beyond reason, like the Macedonians had done. In 2 Corinthians 11 through 15, we see Paul's expounding upon this grace offering and why we should give it some more. Now, therefore, perform the doing of it, that there was a readiness to will, so may also be a performance out of that which you have. For if there be first a willing mind, then accept it that a man, accept according to that a man has, and not according to that he has not. For I mean not to other be at ease and you burdened, but by equality, that now the time of your abundance may be a supply of their want, and that their abundance may also be a supply of your want. There may be equality. As is written, he that gathered much had nothing left over, and he that gathered little had no lack. So he says, not just be willing, but perform what you say you're willing to do. You need to do it out of a willing mind. Remember, back there we looked in Deuteronomy. Every man's to give as he's able, according to how God blessed him. But he wants you to be doing it willingly. And it's, remember, according to how God's blessed you, not according to what you don't have. And the issue here is not how much you give, but how little you keep of what you have. Remember the woman, the widow, who put her mite in, so she put in all her living. And Yeshua said she gave more than those who put in large amounts of silver and gold, because they had left themselves plenty to live on. The world may be measuring your giving by how much you give, but Yeshua is measuring it by how little you keep for yourself. So, and now Paul gives me another reason to do this. And notice where he went to the Torah here, and he talked about the gathering, which I talked about when I talked about giving alms. How we talked about the gathering of the manna, how everyone gathered it, they put in a big pile, and everyone got an omer for a person in their family. So those who gathered much had nothing left over, and those who gathered little had no lack. So your supply. So this equality is he said at this time. Notice at this time. So now you're prospering. They're in deep trouble financially. You are going to help them, but the time may come when you're in trouble and they're going to help you. Yes, there should be. Yes, we are to give the Jewish people, Jewish believers in Israel, but it's meant to be a two-way street. And one example I can think of is a congregation in Burkina Faso in Africa. It was listed at that time as the poorest nation on earth. They had a terrible famine down there. Now, their deep poverty, a congregation down there of believers took an offering and sent it. I remember right, the offering was like $20,000. It was substantial, and sent it to help a ministry in Israel. Well, later that ministry worked with the Israeli government and sent people over there to help them with de-desertification, and sent them all kinds of aid. And that aid was much more than the offering that they had originally given. So yes, it's meant to be a two-way street. We're all mishpachah, Jew and Gentile. We're brothers. We're family together. And this is what smart families, wise families that as a family stay rich generation after generation, is what they do. When they need help, they ask other parts of the family, or sometimes people are like family, friends of the family. They ask for help, expect help, and give each other help. They're often their wealth diversifies. They're making one part of the extended family making money off one thing and off another. As the economy shifts, like some things do well, you actually make more money when the economy's down because there's more demand for them, like certain cheap foods and things. But when the economy gets better, there's less demand, and the prices go down, and you don't do as well. So what did he do? Like they tell you, diversifying your stock portfolio is these families diversify. So some group is always doing well relative to the others, and that group will help the other ones, and eventually it'll be their turn to be helped. And this is what wise families do. Otherwise, their wealth would be picked off one by one. If they don't help each other, one will lose his wealth, and then he won't be there. And later, when someone else is in trouble, they won't be there to help them, and they'll lose their wealth. And eventually, the whole family's lost its wealth. This is not meant to be just a one-way, flowing from Gentile to Jew, believer, flowing from the nations to Israel system. It's also meant for Israel to flow back outward. And it may not be the same little gate you sent to them. I mean, where did those believers in Israel get all that money to help those people in Burkina Faso? Not from their offering from Burkina Faso, but from other believers, say in America, whatever, who had sent them money as well. We're all mishpachah, and we're all meant to help each other. Remember Shaw's arguments for giving the grace offering. Now we're going to look at 2 Corinthians 8, chapter 8 again. We're going to look at verses 16 through 21. Thanks be to God, which put the same earnest care in the heart of Titus for you. For he indeed accepted the exhortation, being more forward of his own accord when we went to you. And we have sent with him the brother who's praised in the gospel throughout all the churches. And not only that, but who also chose of the church to travel with us in this grace, which is ministered us by the glory of the same Lord, and declaration of ready mind. Avoid this, that no man should blame us in this abundance which is ministered to us by us, providing for honest things, not only in the sight of the Lord, but also in the sight of men. So, notice the earnest care of Titus for them. Now, here's the thing in Corinth. Corinth, the city itself, was 50% Jewish, 50% Gentile. And the congregation reflected that. And he's sending Titus to them. But notice Titus not the only one he's sending to them. And Titus was more eager to go. Joel didn't have to tell him twice when he arrived to him. Then Titus already had his bags packed, ready to row. But Titus did not go by himself down there. They sent this brother. This brother, praise all the gospels, is John. So yes, John, who we saw in Galatians before Paul's second journey, has been with him on the third journey this whole time. Why? Because he was chosen by the churches. And why do we know it was John? Why? Because at the end of the Gospel of John, first of all, John walked with Yeshua daily, and one of the few people that, just the 12 apostles, but few had John was arguably Yeshua's best friend on earth when he was here. Some would say Peter, but it's pretty obvious he's the one that's often right, is the one that the disciple Jesus loved, loved especially, or whatever. He gives John to take care of his mother. Okay. And Peter, and he tells Peter he's going to die for following him. And he says, what about John over there? And Yeshua says, what about him? If he stays here till I leave, till I die, why doesn't he follow me? And because of that, this rumor had started and spread. Even the Gospel of John says, Jesus didn't say that. He just said, what's it to you? The rumor was that John wouldn't die. He would live until Yeshua came back to this earth. So his praises were throughout the gospel, were throughout all the churches, all these congregations. So he's chosen the churches. What church? The churches in Jerusalem, where the offerings being taken to. Remember, John was in Jerusalem, Judea. There's churches in Judea, in Jerusalem, Judea, and the other countries have chosen John to go with them, to go with Paul. They're not just leaving the Paul. Again, accountability. And why? So everything be honest. And see, this is the thing. When you give to the organization, you need an external organization watching over it. I generally will not give I generally look for that when I'm thinking about Christian organizations to give to help. I look for something like the ECFA or some group like that, external group for that, which is, like, if I'm right, Evangelical Christian Financial Accountability. An organization that audits their books and make sure they're really doing the money what they say they're doing. Yes, they need money to live on from it and stuff. That's fine. But, how low is their administrative expense? How much, and are they using the money wisely? And if they're collecting for something like this, They said we're going to give 100% to this. Make sure they're really giving 100% to this. This is, if you come across someone that says they're a Christian organization or Messianic or whatever, and they don't have anyone accountable and they refuse to get anyone accountable, just do not trust them. They're not obeying God's word. We're supposed to provide things honest, not just in the sight of the Lord, but in the sight of men. If someone's honest, they should be keeping good books, and their books should bear up to scrutiny. And that's exactly what Shaul is saying should be done with the grace offering. Now, in 2 Corinthians 8:22-24, he continues on about the grace offering here. And we have sent with them our brother, who we often prove diligent in many things, but now much more diligent upon whom which great confidence, which upon the great confidence I have in you. Ready to inquire, Titus, my partner and fellow helper concerning you, or our brethren be required of. They are messengers of the church, the glory of God, of Christ. Therefore, show you to them and before the church is the proof of your love and our boasting on your behalf. Okay, so notice here, he's sitting. He tells them Titus again, who they haven't actually met yet. Okay, if I remember correctly, I mapped all this out. But I believe they have not met him yet. And so he's vouching for him. He's his partner, his fellow helper. And notice Titus has not arrived when this letter has. So, but these brethren, who are these messengers of the churches? Well, what churches? Well, at the very least, the churches from Judea. They sent not just John by himself with Paul, but other ones as well, and messengers perhaps from all the other congregations. Because remember, Paul told the Corinthians, you pick some people and send them with me. Well, he's been telling us, and he said, so I've commanded Galatians, the first place he went, those churches. So all these people now, they don't realize Paul has this large entourage going with him. It's getting larger as he goes along, just for this grace offering, not to mention his other activities. And therefore, so when they get there, he wants to make sure they show the proof of their love, deeds, not just words, in the boasting on their behalf. Paul's been boasting about them, bragging about them, using them, particularly with other Greeks to get them, the feelings of competitiveness. And now he's saying, make my boasting on you good, because you boast to me. Now make it good. Now we're going to look at the next chapter. Shaul talks about this, which is the next chapter of Corinthians, chapter 9. We're starting verses 1-4. As touching the ministry of the saints, it is superfluous for me to write to you, for I know the forwardness of your mind, for which I boast of you to them in Macedonia, that Achaia was ready a year ago, and your zeal has provoked many. Yet I sent the brethren, lest our boasting should be in vain on this behalf. And as I said, you may be ready, lest happily, if they of Macedonia come after me and find you unprepared, we, not to say you, should be ashamed of the same confident boasting. Okay, despite Paul's already writing a lot about this, he says it's a purpose that he writes to the ministry of the saints. And he talked to him about this on his second mission journey, and his second mission when he established Corinth. And he's mentioned it in First Corinthians. He reminds him what he told him what to do in First Corinthians. And he's been telling him about this again. So they know what he's talking about, this ministry of the saints in Jerusalem, this grace offering. And he's been boasting that Achaia, and so it's not just Corinth, it's also Athens and Cenchrea. And you have provoked many, your zeal, playing that Greek competitiveness. The other people have been determined to make a good showing, not to let the Achaeans outdo them. But Paul has sent another group, the ones bringing this letter, in front of Titus and those guys. So when the group shows up to start collecting it and counting it and doing all those things to assure good accountability, show up, that they're ready for them. And that Paul's not embarrassed about the whole thing, and they're not embarrassed. Now, that's what's going to happen if they find if those that come, particularly those that come with Paul, and they find him unprepared. They're gonna be like, "Hey, you've been bragging us about these people, and look, you know." So again, we need not just say we're gonna do something for Israel, do something for Israel, particularly the believers in Israel. In 2 Corinthians 9, 5-7, we continue on. Paul continues on with this message about the grace offering. Therefore, I thought it necessary to exhort the brethren they would go before you and make up before your bounty, wherever you had noticed before, that the same might be right as a matter of bounty, not as covetousness. But this I say, he which spares sparingly shall reap sparingly. He that sows bountifully shall also reap bountifully. Every man according to his purpose in his heart, let him give, not grudgingly of necessity, for God loves a cheerful giver. So notice this here. Again, he sends people beforehand to make it, but he didn't want them to do it out of covetousness. He didn't want them just giving to get, okay? But it is a bounty. But nonetheless, if you bless people, if you bless the people of Israel a little, you're going to be blessed a little. If you bless them a lot, you're going to be blessed a lot. If you curse them a little, you're going to be cursed a little. If you curse them a lot, your blessing or curse is going to be dependent, proportional. It's going to be proportional. So he's saying, don't be coveting, but do recognize it. And it's like if I had stock. If there was a stock, and let's say it wasn't even a stock. There was a company I could trust, and I knew and trusted them, and they've never failed in any of the promises. And they made me an offer and say, if you in this month will buy each share $1 for every dollar share you buy, we'll give you $100 in 3 years' time. And if that was true, if I just give say $10, when the 3 years roll by, I'd get back 1,000. But if I gave 1,000, I'm gonna get back 100,000. How much I reap is going to be proportional to how much I sowed. And again, Yeshua is not measured in dollars like I just did, but not by how much you give out, not by how much you gave, but how little you kept. Okay. But you're not to do it grudgingly of necessity. He's saying, don't be given it just because, just because they've been bragging about it. Because God loves a cheerful giver, which is literally hilarious. The Greek word hilarion, where we get the word hilarious from. So do it as, again, purpose in your heart, back to the Torah, Deuteronomy. Let every man give as he's purposed. 2 Corinthians 9, 8 through 11. Paul continues on with his grace offering. And God is able to make all grace abound towards you, that you shall have all sufficiency in all things, that you always having sufficiency in all things, may abound to every good work. As it is written, he that has dispersed abroad, he has given the poor, his righteousness remains forever. Now he that ministers seed to the sower does both minister bread for your food, multiply your seed sown, and increase the fruits of your righteousness, being rich in everything into all bountifulness, which causes through us thanksgiving to God. So notice, God's able to make all the grace abound towards us. We bless the Jewish people with the grace offering. He's going to abound us with grace as well. And what's the result of that? We're going to have all sufficiency. We're going to have everything we need to abound, to do every good work that he's called us to do. He is promising to give us everything we need for our call if we will help the Jewish people with their call. Jewish people go on about being the chosen people, but many of them do never ask the obvious question: chosen to do what? They were chosen to bring the gospel, to bring the knowledge of God to the Gentiles, to the rest of the world. And if we help them, the believers in Israel particularly, do this and make sure they have what they need to carry out their work, then God will make sure we have what we need to carry out his work for us in our ministry. And not only that, it will not, because he ministers seed to the sower. He is a source of what we have anyways. We have nothing that he did not give us, as I discussed before. And it's not just going to increase the fruits of our righteousness, the outward results of our righteousness. We're going to see. We're not only going to be in our rights, the fruits of our righteousness, in giving this grace offering, but also in everything. We're going to see things the way he sees them, and we're going to do us right and pleasing in his sight more and more, because we're acting on what we know to act on. And because of that, we're going to be rich in all bountifulness. It's going to cause through us thanksgiving to God. People are going to give thanks to God for us fulfilling our ministry, take care of people. And the people of Israel are going to give thanks through us to God for the help we've given them to the grace offering. And now we're going to finish up chapter 9 of 2 Corinthians with verses 12 through 15 in Paul's final appeal about the grace offering. For the administration of this service not only supplies the wants of the saints, but is abundant also by many thanksgiving unto God. While by the experiment of this administration they glorify God through professed subjection to the gospel of Christ, and for your liberal distribution of them and to all men. By their prayer for you, which long after you for the exceeding grace of God in you. Thanks be to God for his unspeakable gift. So notice this. This administration is not just about supplying their needs of this service, this grace offering, but it's also about bringing abundance thanksgiving unto God. That this administration will cause them to glorify God, because our professed subjection to the gospel of God will be evident that it's true. That we say we love Yeshua, but we demonstrate what following Yeshua means. That means, among other things, loving the people of Yeshua, and we're doing it. And notice your liberal distributions unto them and to all men. That's not just to the believers in Israel, but the other people as well. Remember, we're to do good to all men, especially those of the household of faith. So yes, so like we talked, as I discussed earlier, your family first, the employees, your ministers, the poor, in particular the poor in your own area, and the poor in Israel, and then the unbelievers, the poor among the poor, the believers among you first, they're those poor, and then to other people. Just you take care of your own family first, your own mishpachah. So your own mishpachah. So now I want you to. So this is what they're to do. This same thing. When you gave to them, they also took of that as they got their own needs taken care of, perhaps helped other people who weren't even believers. Why? So they could see the goodness of Messiah. So they could see that how Messiah transformed these Gentiles. It's not just say they loved God, as perhaps some Jewish people had done, but had taken no action to help them. But actually, indeed, through this liberal distribution, And this will cause the Jewish people, particularly Israel, to long after you. That they'll pray for you and they'll long after you. They'll want to see you. They will want you to come to Israel and visit them because of the exceeding grace of God in you that was demonstrated through the grace offering. And Paul's final argument, appeal for this grace offering, is the unspeakable gift that God himself gave. God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten son. He gave his son who over to a life of poverty in many ways. In his ministry, he was persecuted. And he was eventually, he was given mock trials. And justice was taken from him. Pilate, when they went to the Romans, they tried him in the Sanhedrin, but they had already passed sentence on him before the trial ever began. And Pilate declared him innocent 3 times, yet they compelled Pilate to have him crucified nonetheless. He gave his son over to be beaten, flogged, nails driven through his hands and his feet, really his palms and his heels. The two of the most sensitive areas in your body where the median nerve is. To eventually die a slow, painful, agonizing death where he slowly suffocated and his heart was crushed from the response of his body trying to deal with the pain. He gave his son to die of pain for you. It's unspeakable that he should do this. It is such a little thing for you to show some appreciation by blessing those whom God promised to bless you if you blessed them through the grace offering. And now I'm going to give you a practical way for you to get in on this grace offering and experience the blessing that comes from God from the grace offering. This is a group that I give to. You do not have to do this to be saved, any of this. But Yeshua kept those feasts. Shaul kept those feasts. The feasts I'm talking about Leviticus 23, the ones that we looked in Deuteronomy. I keep them. They gave Shaul gave offerings to help the Jewish believers in Israel. I do the same thing. I follow his example. I do what he said in his word by giving the grace offering. And this is the group I've been giving to. Notice what they do. Evangelism. They tell the Jewish people in Israel about Messiah. Discipleship. They just don't tell them and then leave them on their own. They teach them how to follow him. A Bible college, the only one in Israel. They teach Jewish believers in Israel how to become ministers in Israel to reach the Jewish people. Because as it says below, the best way to bless Israel is with Yeshua. Yeshua. And by the way, Yeshua is Aramaic. There it is in Arabic. Because they also reach out to the Arabs in Israel to help them come to the faith. And they help the soldiers. There's many lone soldiers in Israel who have no family in the IDF. They come from other countries to serve in the IDF. And during the holidays and those kind of things, they're on their own. And they help these lone soldiers. They become a family to those who have no family, who are there to defend Israel. In humanitarian aid, they help the poor, the orphans, the widows, the foreigners who are living in Israel, Holocaust survivors are noteworthy. And also, they help those who choose not to have an abortion. They don't just tell them don't have an abortion. They make it possible for them not to. If a woman who's not married in Israel gets pregnant, abortions are free. The state pays for them. They're legal, and they're expected. And they give them an offer. They give them an alternative, a real one. Not just say, don't have an abortion, it's murder. You're murdering your child, which is true. But also, if you keep your child, we'll help you, and they do. And lastly, they help women find the rightful place, their rightful place in there, like Phoebe I talked about, who Shaul had sent to collect the grace offering from the Romans, a church he'd never been to. And he picked a woman to do this job. And I've talked about this briefly about the role of women when I was going over Paul and his life and his teaching. They put these things in. Now there's other organizations you can help that you can send also. But I urge you, do something. I recommend this one highly. I researched it. They did not find me. They did not appeal to me. They did not come to me. I looked for them. I was zealous to find someone like the Macedonians. And I give during those holidays, but you may not celebrate those holidays. Give during a holiday you do, or no holiday at all. Any time is a good time to give to the causes of the Father, the cause of Yeshua, to obey the gospel, to give the grace offering, to bless Israel so that you may be blessed. Don't just say you love Yeshua and his people, the Jewish people in Israel in particular. Do something to back up your words. It's deeds, not words, that win in the end. Till next week, shalom.